Welcome back, everybody. So President Cyril Ramaphosa will announce his cabinet later this week. There's much speculation as to who will be in or out. And of course, there is also the key position of a deputy president that still has a question mark over. Addressing the nation at his inauguration on Saturday, Ramaphosa said South Africans were tired of words and they want action. So with this in mind, what are some of the key issues expected from his presidency? To help us analyze this, in studio with us, we've got public policy analyst TK Pooe. And, we're hoping to be joined in the middle of this conversation by Khaya Sithole. We're trying to get hold of him via Skype. We're having a bit of issues, but if you suddenly see his face popping up, don't be surprised. He'll be joining us as well, hopefully sometime in the conversation. But TK, you and I can begin. It's great to see you. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Good. Did you enjoy the inauguration?
It was nice and sweet and short, the speech part.
It was, wasn't it?
Yeah, which is very good, I think. And I also enjoyed the show, the airplane shows. It was quite nice.
So it was quite nice. But, you know, the whole talk about the money being put aside for all of that, I mean, was it worth it at the end of the day to spend that much on the inauguration?
I think it's never really worth it if you have to, look, you have to contextualize what South Africa is and what we are as a developing country, but there's certain parts where there's just abject poverty. So my argument's always been, listen, why can't you just simply just do a simple, just a simple speech over the TV? Because what we really do want to hear more than seeing the show that's been put on is just what's the message going forward. So look, I'm with those people who say, listen, I think we don't really have to do so much pomp and ceremony. But some people say, listen, we're hosting international guests, and that actually would be a very good way to actually show them this is what South Africa is about. But I would listen, we're just not really as rich as we'd like to be. Yeah,
maybe hold back a little bit. But Khaya is on the line now, so we're not going to have him via Skype, but we have got him on the phone. So it's great to have you with us, Khaya. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning. Good morning to the viewers.
So Khaya, I began by asking TK his sort of observations over the weekend at the inauguration, and was it all worth it? Wasn't it important that we went that big on the inauguration?
I'm not a big fan of the type of pageantry that we saw on Saturday, particularly in light of really the state of public finances as it is right now. For me, it comes across as an event that will appear to the layman to be tone deaf to the realities of what South Africans are going through. I mean, hours before the inauguration, we were told that the president signed into law the carbon tax bill, which simply means that your petrol price at the pump next month is going up by another 9 cents if you're using petrol, another 10 cents if you're using diesel. So, of course, there seem to be this escalating cost of living that seem to be burdened on us, and yet the politicians of the day do not seem to share the same sentiment of saying that perhaps we should cut back on particular expenses. This was entirely discretionary. There is no law that forces the president to spend so much money on just being able to say an oath for 5 minutes and then everything else that comes with it. So for me, it was really an inappropriate event in light of where we are as a country.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the carbon tax, because that was going to be my exact next question to something that I think we may have slipped through the cracks a little bit over the weekend in all the euphoria of the president being sworn in and inaugurated. And this was signed into law now, this whole Carbon Tax Act, and this is going to be now coming into effect from the 1st of June, which is next week, Saturday. And this is going to affect us, it's going to affect miners, it's going to affect a lot of industries here in South Africa. Can we afford something like this right now?
Well, you have to look at it within the context of, this is where I've always had a problem with South African policy, where, look, you get the gist of it, which falls in line with a lot of what's been happening with the COPs, which is we are all for saving the earth and having a green economy. But again, the context is we're a developing country, and in a country where, look, we don't have actual public transport, that's one. Taxis are not public transport. It's a private enterprise which happens to take in a lot of the public. It really does have to make us think, say, listen, all this policy, which is quite futuristic, but does it really answer the core question? And you actually touch on a lot of the industries. Listen, the nature of unemployment in South Africa is such that we still need a lot of manufacturing and a lot of mining. So if now a mining house tells you, but listen, you're putting an extra burden on, basically putting an extra burden on how I'm going to do my cost to business. I think it should have really been, we should have actually listened a bit more to actually what was the logic behind this, and we should have actually heard what business has to say. Because this is the key question I always ask when you make policy in South Africa, and I think this is always, and I think Khaya touched on it, it's the tone deafness of our political system and elite, is that they seem to have an idea which outstrips what's like the reality of what South Africans are facing. And this is where we've always had this policy incoherence, where you want to do this because it appeases the international community, community. But when we actually look at the ground level, this actually takes away from a lot of the opportunities going forward, which we might need.
Yeah. Well, why the urgency, Khaya? I mean, why was this the first priority to sign into law?
I wouldn't say it was the first priority. There's actually a lot of bills that are outstanding, and we know how the political process works. These things get approved by parliamentarians, and then they only simply wait for the president to send his signature. Now, of course, we've seen in the past that that process can take up to 8 months in the case of Mr. Jacob Zuma, without anyone ever explaining exactly why these things are being left to stay in limbo. But I do suspect with this one in particular, it was simply a matter of, well, now that you've got this particular gap between what has happened last week and the inauguration, here are some of the things that you can get out of the way from your in-tray. And this, unfortunately, was one of the bills that was left there that was available to be signed into law, and he simply did that. I don't think it was anything malicious on the part of the president. Of course, if we wanted to object, we should have objected at the point in time when the law was being drafted, not necessarily when he's then being told to sign it in.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose the question now is, I mean, what's going to happen to all this coal that we have? And we've tried to sort of position ourselves in a very big way under the presidency of former President Jacob Zuma, and now we're moving in a completely different direction. And what does this bode? Does this bode in not such a good way for Eskom? I'm going to ask you this as well, Khaya.
Yeah, I think for me, the key problem that we have with this country's policy formulation process is that I don't know if people are actually necessarily going to respond to it. So if you want people to then say, okay, fine, if there's an additional carbon tax, then I need to stop doing whatever it is that was expanding my carbon footprint. Now, in relation to people who travel to work, for example, if you're going to say that this carbon tax is created in order to deter people from really just doing the things that they've been doing over the past few years or however long it's been, and then to get them to change their behavior, it's a bit difficult, because then the question would be, how does one actually react to this by saying, oops, if that's going to be an additional 10 cents, therefore this one I need to do differently in order to actually minimize the carbon imprint that I have on the environment. Unfortunately, if people are traveling to taxis, to work using taxis or buses, that's exactly what they're going to do even after next week. So I do think that we have that particular gap where literally the type of policies you put in place aren't particularly relevant for the type of society that you have, simply because the society will acknowledge that the tax exists, but there is nothing they can do to move away from it. So for me, that becomes one of the enduring questions of how do we actually make this thing practical and relevant and actually achieve the outcomes. All we're going to see now is that the state is going to raise additional taxes. Now, whether those additional taxes are then going to be geared towards, making the environment more carbon friendly or making consumer behavior more environmentally friendly, it's something that I struggle to see.
Okay. All right. Let's move on now, because we could sit and talk about this forever, but there's so much more to get through. Let's talk about the cabinet now. Everybody expecting the announcement today. Some optimists saying yesterday there could have already been a cabinet announcement, but now we got another announcement saying that it'll happen later this week. So educate us a little bit. Now, once a president is sworn in, do ministerial positions become vacant, or are the ministers still ministers right now?
From my understanding, it's certain critical ones I think still stay the same. There's almost a contingency plan which is put into place. That's why during the elections you could still see someone like Minister Sithole still act as the DECO minister. But what tends to happen is until the new parliament actually gets put in properly, I think everything still stays the same, I think to a certain bit. But I think the Constitution also makes an allowance in those situations that the president can quickly call people into call the previous administration into his office. But the key thing is, look, it's not unheard of for the president to take their time. If anything, you'd actually hope that the president would actually be using the time, adequately. So I don't think people should really be alarmed that he's taking his time. Obviously, it leaves a lot of room for speculation. And if there's one thing we've kind of seen with President Cyril Ramaphosa, he's not really one who actually likes speculation being ongoing. He likes being quite direct, but I always say, listen, rather take your time and give us something which is of quality and of substance than us to later on say, but look, you could have done X and Y. So I think it's not unheard of. It's actually quite normal for a president to take their time, and the Constitution allows it. So I think as long as we just say, listen, it's normal, it's a part and parcel of the political game, I think we're fine with that.
So, I mean, if we look at some of the developments pertaining to Pravin Gordhan as well as to Didi Mabuza, and, you look at most newspapers, most media pundits all speculating that that's at the heart of this delay, if there is even a delay? I mean, because there was never a date given to us when the cabinet was going to be announced. But would this be sort of dragging on a little longer than anticipated because of the scenarios around the two of them?
I've tended to look at it like this. I don't actually look at the hoo-ha, what's happening with the deputy president and what's happening with certain ministers, because none of us are, have got the purview of the president currently. So you might find it could just be a simple issue that is actually going around. If you don't mind, I'll give a famous example of what you used to hear about President Thabo Mbeki, is that he would actually wait till probably 12 in the evening and actually start calling in potential ministers one by one. Oh. And depending on which exit you use, you'd know what was happening. So it's just, you could just find that this is somebody this is the way he prefers to do it. And I think sometimes speculation is not healthy in that it kind of creates an environment where, the populace has an expectation from the media. They're saying, oh, well, look, who's not going to be deputy, who's not going to be deputy. Only to find, but wait, you guys had been pointing that way. So for me, I just rather look at it as saying, give the person his time to do what they're doing. And I think the key thing for us as a population, which would be quite different to South Africa, is actually start saying, listen, let's actually go through the speech and let's actually go through previous speeches and actually say, what is it that we actually expect this president and how are we going to hold him to account? Because I think to simply hold a process to account doesn't really make much of a difference. What we should be asking is, listen, he is the new president. How am I, as a citizen, now going to actively start participating in the available political processes, i.e. on my street or in school councils? And I think that's where we actually need to start moving as a citizenry. Because this belief that one president is going to solve everything, it's actually, this is how we got into this mess in the first place.
And it is. I mean, there is a sense that our president is a savior and is coming to save us all. But this is not the reality. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Khaya, let's bring you in here. We talk about the delay in the appointment, if in fact there is a delay, and the issues that are happening within the ANC, and perhaps some internal wrangling. We do know, it's not a secret that there is wrangling happening. But do you read anything into the ministerial positions and waiting for it, and perhaps especially with the developments for Pravin Gordhan and Didi Mabuza?
Look, I don't think there is a delay necessarily, because the president has never committed to any time frame that we can now say, oh, he's missed the deadline that he set for himself. For me, it was always going to be a question of, once he's made his decision, of course, he then has to go and meet with the ANC, particularly the top six and the National Working Committee, and say, guys, this is the type of administration I've decided to have, and these are the people that I want to have here. So that was always going to be a Monday conversation, unless he could have found a way to do it sooner, as in yesterday, which clearly did not happen. So I do think what we're seeing here is that obviously he now needs to apply his mind to say, what are the consequences, particularly of the reports that were released by the public protector last week Friday. And I think for him, the big headache, of course, relates to what happens to Mr. Pravin Gordhan. And the key issue here is that in spite of who the report was about, we have set a precedent in the country, which has been affirmed by a court, that the public protector's findings are binding until they are overturned by a competent court. Now, unfortunately, the way the justice system works is that that's a very slow, methodical process. We know even in the Reserve Bank matter, it's still sitting at the Constitutional Court. It's almost 6 months now since the matter was heard, and we still don't have, a resolution on what happens to the public protector's cost order. So even if Mr. Gordhan were to then launch a review application, this is not something that's going to be settled overnight. So the gamble that the president needs to take is either he needs to apply his mandate and say, do I then give this man an opportunity to do his executive functions until the court tells me otherwise, or do I then simply live in limbo, knowing very well that he's been one of the foot soldiers that has done a lot of work over the past year in trying to fix state-owned enterprises. And I suspect that the president is going to gravitate towards saying, well, until the man is proven guilty in a court of law, perhaps I should do things a bit differently.
Yeah. I mean, there's been, again, TK, you spoke to, if we go back on some of the speeches that the president has given, he's made a lot of promises. He really has. Reduce poverty, increase the economy, challenge youth unemployment problem, fix the education system, reduce the size of the cabinet, get rid of corruption. These are just some of those things. Talk to me about your thoughts going forward for this president.
Well, look, I'll just try to categorize them. One, let's say the economy. Look, to simply say you're going to reduce things like inequality, I think it's a noble ambition. But truth be told, if you look at the structure and just the model of the South African economy, you have to actually looking at a 10 to a 15-year project. By that I mean, look at what's happening with the international markets. We've just said, listen, we want to try to do away with coal. Well, look, it's good for you to say that, but if that's become one of your biggest sellers, what's going to be this alternative substitute now? And when you look at the issue of unemployment, again, it's a type and nature of unemployment in South Africa which makes it hard for the youth. That's not something you fix within 2 or 3 years. That's something that's actually going to take 10 to 15 years, because you need to get basic education, higher education, and also TVETs into line. So for me, what I would actually prefer the president actually says to say, listen, let me be honest with you guys. This is a 10 to 15 year project, which yes, the ANC has actually been negligent in doing. And for this, to rather don't get our hopes up to say, listen, I'm going to do this in 5 years. It's impossible. You can't do that. So I think that's one. And two, the issue of actually getting, I think, the population back in line to believe that, listen, the law is the law. I think that's probably one of the biggest problems he's going to have, because what people tend to forget is, and I think the population remind the president is, until we see people actually go to prison, we will not believe. In this situation, we're Peter, we're doubting Thomases, because we've seen people get away and live a life which really is beyond their means, and it's actually become quite normal, even in our society. We, as a population, have even started to imbue the system to say, listen, well, why not pay a police officer off if I really want to get our things? So for you to change it, not unless you're Jesus himself, tomorrow I doubt that's going to change. So I think it's a societal project, and I think the president needs to be, if he was really wise to it, he'd actually just frame it in that way to say, listen, this is a societal journey we all have to be on.
Yeah, indeed. I want to ask you a question, though, Khaya. I'm going to come to you on the line there. Former President Jacob Zuma not attending the inauguration. What did you think about this? What did you read into that?
Yeah, it was a bit surprising, because what has been different between former President Jacob Zuma and former President Thabo Mbeki in particular, in how they conducted themselves in the aftermath of being ejected from the presidency. Thabo Mbeki retreated and avoided as many ANC functions as he could, and he only showed up, and it was always a surprise when he did show up for anything. Jacob Zuma, on the other hand, has been absolutely everywhere, whether it's an NEC meeting, a special NEC meeting, every single thing where Jacob Zuma could show up, he has shown up, until, of course, this particular Saturday. So it was surprising to a lot of people that he would miss this one event in particular. We are obviously of the impression that he was invited because one of his wives was there.
Yeah.
So I think for me, him missing it was actually quite strange, and I don't know if it is consistent with the way he's behaved himself, because he's always been the type of person who wanted to put forward the message that, look, I'm not sulking about how I was treated, I've moved on, and I'm going to support. I'm now a rank and file member of the ANC like everybody else. And of course, this particular inauguration is the type of event where he ought to have showed up, particularly because most of the people there, the world leaders that were in attendance, are the people that he used to work with in various capacities. So you'd have seen this as an opportunity for him to re-engage with them. So I do think him not showing up was quite intentional. It's not really clear what his intentions are.
Yeah, just very, very finally, TK, before we need to take a break. Busisiwe Mkhwebane, our public protector, what are your views on her? I mean, releasing 6 reports, all of this before we know this is a very big week. I mean, can we read anything into the timing of this? Some people saying, give her a chance, she needs another chance, but also holding very big question marks over these findings of hers.
I think this is where we probably need to ask the question, is her performance in line with what's been agreed upon in the Constitution? As in, is she doing a constitutional job? Now, the issues of timing, it could be just a preference thing. Obviously, people would say, ideally, one would not like it, but I don't think we should actually read too much into it. The question I would ask is her performance thus far in line with what the Constitution wants, and is it a sterling job, as we've seen in previous years by the other public prosecutor? Now, if we to answer those 3 things, then I think we can actually have a productive conversation going forward. But if it's a preference, people saying, look, I don't prefer the way she's doing, I don't find that productive at all. I'd rather say, hey, is she doing what her job entails her to do, and is she doing it excellently? And there's actually a record at the moment of a lot of her decisions seemingly being overturned, but she's contesting them, and I think that's where we should actually be looking to see what is she actually doing an excellent job as the current PP.
Does she have an agenda? Because that's the big question that everyone's asking.
Look, I think every human being alive has an agenda, but the key question is to say her agenda actually should be quite simple for us to judge, which is she doing a constitutional mandate? And if she's doing anything outside of them, then I think we should be worried. Yeah.
Final question, Khaya. I've been given some grace to take up to 7 o'clock. Deputy President position. We've been speculating about this for a while, and it almost, from a lot of people reading and the delays and whatever we can read into this, it looks like David Mabuza may come in again as the Deputy President of the country. But what are your views?
Yeah, I think one of the key things, James, is that sometimes the ANC will be presented with opportunities where you can actually exhibit an understanding of the distinction between the party and the state. Just because a person is fit enough to be the deputy president of the country doesn't necessarily mean that is the ideal person to be the deputy president of the country. And I think in the Mabuza case, we're seeing a clear example of that. Now, of course, last week when he postponed his swearing in, you got the impression that he was working on some political arrangement, which was either to say, look, I will do this job provided these particular guarantees are made, or I'm not going to do this job because of these particular findings against me. Now, he will be meeting the Integrity Committee over the course of today and tomorrow, and he'll make his representations. And if that committee then forms the opinion that he's now fit for office, then, of course, things will be a bit different. It is, of course, impossible for the Integrity Committee to meet him over a day or two and then suddenly overturn its own findings, because really the type of things that they said about him were not the issues that can be fixed overnight. So I do think that if he does become the deputy president of the country, it is simply because Cyril Ramaphosa has gone back and said there is a political risk associated with me alienating my deputy president of the party and not putting him into the union buildings. We've seen an example of this in 2005 when Thabo Mbeki did the same thing to Jacob Zuma. So it will simply be because they've reached a political settlement, not because suddenly we've discovered that Mabuza is the best person to be the deputy president of the country.
All right, Khaya Sithole, thanks for you talking to us, and also TK Pooe, thank you very, very much as well. It's 7 o'clock. Let's get your news from Sakina.